Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 73, The First Woman Hung in South Australia. I came across a site that covered unsolved mysteries where the question was raised whether Elizabeth Woolcock was a murderer or a victim. In September 1873, in Moonta, South Australia, Thomas Woolcock died slowly from mercury poisoning. His wife, Elizabeth Woolcock, was convicted of his murder and became the only woman hanged in South Australia. Many believe she was innocent. Elizabeth Woolcock was born Elizabeth Lillian Oliver and was the second child of four, born to John Hosking Oliver and Elizabeth Tresize in Burra, South Australia, on the 20th of April 1848. Her father, John Hosking Oliver, was born in Cornwall, England in 1810. He married Catherine Merrifield in Cornwall in November 1835. However, she died 3.5 years after their marriage. 4 years after the death of his first wife, he married Elizabeth Tresize in the Registry Office at Cornwall in July 1843. Elizabeth was the daughter of James and Elizabeth Tresize from Cornwall and was born in February 1820. Her father was a miner. Elizabeth had also married earlier to William Grenfell Williams on the 2nd of November 1840. He died on the 18th of May 1842, leaving Elizabeth with 2 children. William Grenfell Williams, born on the 26th of January 1841 in Cornwall, and Mary Martha Williams, born on the 2nd of October 1842 in Cornwall. When her husband died, Elizabeth was only 4 months pregnant with Mary. Family trees do not have a formal marriage record listed for John Hosking Oliver and Elizabeth Tresize. John Oliver and Elizabeth Tresize's firstborn, John, was born in 1845 in Cornwall, and he died at the age of 16 months in September 1846. John and Elizabeth immigrated to South Australia in January 1847 with Elizabeth's 2 children on the barque the David Malcolm from Plymouth. So the next child, Elizabeth Lillian, was born on the 20th of April 1848 at the Burra mine north of Adelaide. Then Catherine, who was born at Kapunda, South Australia, on the 4th of April 1850. There is a death for Elizabeth's sister Catherine in Ballarat, Victoria in December 1862, which is recorded in some family trees, but there's no death record to substantiate this. The next child in the family, another sibling for Elizabeth, was John Henry Oliver, who was born on the 9th of July 1851 at Burra, but died on the 8th of January 1852 at Burra, only 6 months old. So Elizabeth was the only surviving child of 4, of John Hosking Oliver and Elizabeth Tresize. It seems that John and Elizabeth left their daughter behind in South Australia in 1852, presumably to seek gold in Ballarat, Victoria, when Elizabeth was only 4. Elizabeth stated in her confession that her father had died in 1857. However, John Oliver died at Creswick, Victoria, on the 14th of May 1873 at the age of 63. Interestingly, Catherine Merrifield was listed as his spouse, further strengthening the theory that he never married Elizabeth Tresize. Elizabeth Tresize married John Bolitho Johns, an Englishman, in St Matthew's Church, Kensington, South Australia, in 1860. When Elizabeth was 40 and John 38. John had previously been married to Jane Jenkin in 1846 in Cornwall, England, and John and Jane arrived in South Australia on the Lady Bruce from London in November 1846. They lived at Second Creek, South Australia, and had 5 children together, with only 2 surviving into adulthood. Jane died on the 23rd of March 1853 at Clifton, South Australia. So it seems that Elizabeth Tresize commenced a relationship with John Bolitho Johns at least 5 years before their marriage, as they had 3 children together: Caroline in 1855, John Jr. in 1856, and Thomas in 1858. Elizabeth Lillian Oliver returned to live with her mother and stepfather in Moonta, South Australia in 1860, the year that they had married, when she was 12 years old. John Bolitho Johns died in 1868 at Sebastopol, Victoria, and his death was recorded in the local Ballarat paper. On Tuesday night, an accident occurred at the St George Company's claim in Ballarat, by which a man named John Johns, a native of Cornwall, was killed and another, Henry Connolly, was seriously, if not fatally, injured. Johns, it appears, had ascended a ladder in the jump-up and was about 70 feet from the bottom. Some ground overhead gave way, fell, and struck him heavily. Connolly immediately mounted the ladder to render him assistance, but a second fall of earth occurred and precipitated both to the bottom of the shaft. When raised, Johns was found quite dead and Connolly suffering a severe injury. It is thought a fracture of the neck. He was admitted on Wednesday morning in the district hospital, where he remains in a very critical state. Johns has left a wife and 5 children. However, Connolly is unmarried. And another article, we're informed that Mr Harvey has expressed a wish to the Reverend W. Floyd and Mr J. Urins that a portion of the proceeds of the entertainment given at the Alfred Hall on Tuesday be handed over to the widow of Johns, whose husband was killed recently at the claim at St George Company. Johns left 5 children and the family is in a state of destitution. Elizabeth died on the 20th of September 1907 in South Australia. And a couple of articles outlining her death. Johns. At her son-in-law's residence, R.R. Slape of Slape's Gully, Burnside, the dearly beloved mother of Mary Slape in her 90th year. And the friends of the late Mrs. Elizabeth Johns are informed that her funeral will leave her son-in-law's, Mr. Robert Slape, residence 3rd Creek, Burnside. Other reports in Elizabeth's life say that she was a witness to a brutal murder of a family friend. She was the victim of a vicious rape at just 7, and sadly she became addicted to opium that was prescribed to help her cope with her ordeal. She also worked in a chemist shop run by the owners of the household in which she lived, and this gave her access to more of the opioid drugs that were to make her life bearable at this point. But most importantly too, she had knowledge of how these drugs were made. So in 1863, at 15 years old, she moved to the bright lights in the big city of Ballarat, where she inadvertently fell in with a group of prostitutes. After initially being shocked at their lifestyle, she soon realised that there was money to be made from this way of life. She also quickly realised that her knowledge of how to make drugs could help her and the other girls make money from customers without having to sleep with them. She created a potion that could be slipped into a man's drink. When he slipped into semi-unconsciousness, the girls would ransack his pockets and make off with whatever cash or valuables they found. Eventually, Elizabeth was found in Ballarat by a preacher from South Australia and taken back to Moonta in 1865, where at 17 she was reunited with her mother and stepfather. She found work as a live-in housekeeper for widower Thomas Woolcock in Moonta. Thomas James Woolcock was born on the 26th of June 1837, also in Cornwall, England. He had married Anne Thomas Moore, known as Nanny, at Truro, Cornwall, England, in April 1860 when he was 23 and Anne 19. They had 2 sons, Richard Francis Woolcock, born in 1861 in Cornwall, and Thomas John Woolcock, born in September 1863, also in Cornwall. Thomas and Anne emigrated to South Australia on the 26th of December 1865 on the Gosforth from Plymouth. Thomas was a miner at the copper mines at Moonta, and his wife Anne died on the 6th of May 1866 at Moonta, and this was when Elizabeth Oliver was employed as his live-in housekeeper to look after the 2 children. Thomas and Anne's son Richard died at the age of 5 on the 5th of December 1866 at Moonta. Rumours of his relationship with Elizabeth, who was 11 years younger than Thomas, caused a huge scandal in the small town. So in May 1867, they married at North Yelta in the Moonta district. Thomas was 29 and Elizabeth 18. Their marriage was against the advice of Elizabeth's stepfather, John Johns. So as a result, Elizabeth became stepmother to the 2 young children, Thomas and Richard. Unfortunately, it was not a happy marriage. Thomas drank heavily and became increasingly demanding and abusive. He wouldn't allow her to leave the house and didn't give her enough money to keep the household. Elizabeth ran away twice, but in a pattern all too familiar even now, he managed to talk her into returning. On the 24th of July 1869, in the Wallaroo Times and Mining Journal at Port Wallaroo, South Australia, Thomas Woolcock put a notice in the paper. I, Thomas Woolcock of Moonta Mines, will not be answerable for any debt my wife, Elizabeth Woolcock, may contract after this date. And that was on the 21st of July, 1869. So that was obviously one of the times that Elizabeth had left him, and he was ensuring that she would not be able to book up anything at any shops in the area. Then in September 1873, after several weeks of illness, Thomas died. A post-mortem confirmed that he had died from mercury poisoning. An excessive amount of mercury was found in Thomas's liver. Elizabeth had been sending her stepson Tom to the local pharmacies to buy mercury compounds to treat head lice, but a coroner's inquest believed that she'd actually been using them to slowly poison her husband. Details of the inquest into Thomas Woolcock's death was outlined in the Adelaide Express and Telegraph in September 1873. Suspicious death at Yelta. An inquest was held on Thursday on the body of Thomas Woolcock, who died at 3 a.m. on the 4th of September, and concerning whose decease rumours of poison were prevalent. The jury, having viewed the body, gave the following evidence. John Dickey, MD, deposed, I was called in to see the deceased on the 27th of July. He had wished to be admitted into the Oddfellows Lodge. Gave it as my opinion that he was suffering from a bilious attack. The symptoms were very undefined. He had a slight gastric irritation about him, and I thought I saw symptoms of gastric fever setting in. The symptoms were only premonitory, so I thought it best to wait a few days before making up my mind as to the case. I gave him some simple aperient pills and intended to call in a day or two. It seems he got worse, so I sent for Dr. Bull. I did not return, but left him in Dr. Bull's charge. The deceased had become an Oddfellow, of which order I am a surgeon, and as such was obliged to report his sickness to the lodge. I came in again and found that he had been under Doctors Herbert and Bull. The deceased told me of it himself. He said Dr. Herbert, having a case in the neighbourhood, he called him in. I again examined him and found him to have symptoms of gastric fever. He told me Dr. Herbert had salivated him. The symptoms of salivation were wearing away when I saw him. We consulted together as to whether Dr. Herbert should wait on him. I arranged to again take him in my charge as lodge doctor. I told him to tell Dr. Herbert, and if agreeable to all parties, I would take charge of him. This visit was on the 11th of August. I tended him every 2 to 3 days and gave him medicine, but the gastric and intestinal irritation still continued in spite of medicine. The deceased had a severe bowel complaint and vomited all the time. Not a particle of food would lie on his stomach. The vomiting was usually worse towards the evening. He was suffering from severe diarrhoea. There were very few head symptoms during his illness, which was an unusual circumstance in these cases. The deceased only got a little giddy sometimes. Latterly, some dark-coloured spots of effused blood appeared on the skin, as in scurvy. These no doubt arose from the poverty of the system. The deceased was gradually getting more emaciated and exhausted. His mind remained clear to the end. There are a variety of irritating poisons which would give rise to similar results. The likeliest would be mercury, more especially bichloride of mercury or a corrosive sublimate. My reason for refusing to grant a certificate of death was in consequence of a relation of the deceased calling on me the night before he died to ask about his case and to ask whether I thought he had been getting any poison. Mrs. Snell, the person who called, said she had heard rumours of something having been given to him which he should not have got. She had called on the different chemists in the town and asked if any poison had been obtained. She also stated that Mrs. Woolcock had been in the town with a friend and obtained at Opie's a preparation of morphus. This was shortly before the deceased's illness. The doctor then stated, though, that morphia would induce coma-like symptoms and certainly not produce vomiting unless it's in large doses, and it would certainly not produce purging or irritation of the bowels. And it was owing to the prevalent rumours that I refused to certify a cause of death, thought under the circumstances it was well an inquiry should take place, and I regard the death as arising from natural causes. John Opie, the chemist, stated that on the 19th of May he received a note signed Elizabeth Woolcock. It was brought by a little boy asking me to send 1 shilling's worth of muriate of morphine and some cherry laurel water. Having been told it was for medicinal purposes, I sent 5 grains, a quantity I justified in sending. A bottle was sent and I labelled it twice poison according to the poison regulations. I then wrapped it in white paper and marked poison on the outside. Cherry laurel water is harmless. A few days afterwards, a boy came asking me for more medicine. I wrote a memo saying I could not send any more as it was a poison and asking Mrs. Woolcock to come herself that she might explain what it was for. Some time elapsed when Mrs. Woolcock came and asked why I did not send it. I told her I was not allowed to sell it without a witness or knowing what it was for. She then left and called again on June the 25th with a witness, Mrs. Hannah Blight. Mrs. Woolcock's first words were, "I've got a witness now." Mrs. Woolcock asked for 3 or 4 shillings worth of morphia. I asked the usual question, "What do you want it for?" And she said, "I've been told it would remove iron mould from clothes." I told her I'd never heard of this being used for that purpose, but I would sell her something less poisonous, salts of lemon, which would answer the same purpose. She said no, she wanted that. I then said to Mrs. Blight, "I suppose you know that Mrs. Woolcock is going to do with it? You being a witness would be responsible and thereby take it off my hands," meaning that I should not be responsible. And she said, "All I know about it is that Mrs. Woolcock came to my place and asked me if I would go into town with her in the trap as she wanted some poisons to take the stains of iron moulds out of some clothes. I consented to go, thinking no harm, having known her so long, to oblige her. I then said to Mrs. Woolcock, "You had better take the salts of lemon, as I do not care to sell the morphia, it being so poisonous." Mrs. Woolcock seemed confused and replied, "I want it for chemical purposes." I, hardly knowing what to do in the case, wrote in my poison book the date, the quantity, the use, the residence, and the seller's name. I got Mrs. Woolcock to sign her name as being the purchaser. Having misgivings as to whether I should be justified in giving her that quantity of morphus, I declined to let her have it. Mrs. Woolcock and Mrs. Blight then left without having received it from me. From what a bystander said, I was glad I had not let her have the poison. It was a Mrs. Woods of Greens Plains who was the bystander referred to. I felt it my duty to inform Sergeant Bentley of the application for the poison. Mrs. Wood had heard that Mrs. Woolcock threatened to injure herself. I know nothing against Mrs. Woolcock. Mrs. Snell called on me yesterday stating there were rumours of the deceased having met with foul play and asking me whether I had heard anything of it. Mrs. Hannah Blight of Moonta Mines deposed, "I knew the deceased previous to his illness. I remember accompanying Mrs. Woolcock into Moonta Township. We left without getting it, went to no other chemist, went straight home. Mrs. Woolcock asked me to go with her for company, and I said I would. For anything I know of them to the contrary as neighbours, the deceased and Mrs. Woolcock lived happily together. Mrs. Woolcock was the deceased's second wife." Edward Bentley, Sergeant of Police stationed at Moonta, said, "I have seen the body and recognised that of a man who about the commencement of July came to me at the police station and complained that someone up here at Yelta was annoying him. The hobbles had been taken once from his horses. At another time the stable door had been opened and his horse let out. He said these things were not stolen, but they were done to annoy me. I would not come to you now, only a watchdog I had has been poisoned, and I want you to go round to the chemists and see if any poison has been sold." I inquired and found no one had sold any poison likely to kill dogs. I saw the deceased afterwards and told him the result. He thanked me and seemed very pleased. He said anyone who would poison my dog might poison me. I've been round and made every possible inquiry as to the rumour of foul play. I can get no direct information. Everyone seems to have heard a rumour, but no one seems to have any knowledge of its truth. My first knowledge of it came from Mr. Opie. It was mentioned by the jury that 2 women had called into Mr. Burke's, the chemist, for morphia, and it was about the time it was inquired for at Opie's, so not long ago, and it was 20 grains that they applied for and were also refused at Burke's. Elizabeth Snell stated, "I knew the deceased. He was my first cousin. The evening before last I heard from a Mrs. Allen that some chemicals were purchased in the town. The police had knowledge of it and that during his illness Dr. Herbert told the deceased to watch his medicine. I saw the deceased a day before yesterday and also a fortnight ago. I had a little conversation with him. I know of nothing that would lead me to believe that there was foul play. The deceased said he was treated well by his wife during his illness." John Snell stated, "I knew the deceased. I was with him when he died at 3 a.m. on Thursday morning. I saw him usually about twice a week during his illness. He never manifested any disturbance in his mind, nor suspicion as to the nature of his sickness or of foul play. Elizabeth Woolcock deposed, "The deceased was my husband. On the 23rd he fell sick. He was taken while at work. He often used to complain before. I wish to state that I met with a misfortune and upset a bottle of ink over my skirt. I heard from someone that morphine would remove it. I had tried salt of lemons and found it would not remove them. I never sent a letter to town signed by my name. Asked Mrs. Blight to go with me as a witness to get the morphine as it was a poison. Went to Opie's and was refused. I never told Mrs. Woods I'd make away with myself. She lived at Cadena and I down here. I only know her to pass the time of day. I did not send to Cadena about 2 months ago for morphine. Never saw any morphine until Dr. Dickey gave it to my husband as medicine. It was then mixed with sugar. I don't remember how long it was after the dog was poisoned that the deceased was taken ill. It might have been a fortnight to 3 weeks. I never sent a letter signed by myself by a boy for morphine. I took a witness because I was aware for years of the practice in relation to poisons. I believe I did try to get the morphine myself without getting a witness. Having known Mr. Opie so long, I thought he would have no objection letting me have it without a witness. I never got any morphine at all. I never had 5 grains of muriate of morphine from Mr. Opie." John Opie was recalled, and he stated, "I am not certain that the note of which I spoke was sent by Mrs. Woolcock. It bore her name, but I could not identify the signature. I think it resembled the signature in my poison book, the book that was produced and examined by the jury. I have destroyed the note. It is not customary to keep such notes. I did not know the boy who brought the note. I think it was Mrs. Woolcock's stepson, but could not be certain. Mrs. Woolcock came to me. I presume it was in answer to my note. She came without a witness. She made no reference to the note. I told her I could not sell the poison without a witness. I do not now remember whether she made a reference to the note. She said, as near as I can recollect, that she had come for the medicine for which she had sent the boy. The description given in the note was it was for medical purposes." Thomas John Woolcock, aged 11. He stated, "I am the son of Thomas Woolcock, deceased. I went to Mr. Opie's once. It was about a month ago. I took a note. The stuff was in a bottle. It was for mother. I gave the note to Mr. Opie. He gave me the stuff and I went straight back and I gave it to mother. I went a second time to Mr. Opie's and he gave me a note to give to my mother. I gave her the note. The last time I went for precipitate powders, I brought them home to mother. I think she told me it was to put in her hair. I went once to Mr. Bathine's for medicine. I believe I took a note there. I bought precipitate powders at Opie's, also at Bathine's and some at Birks's. Father was not sick at the time. I don't remember when father was first sick. I don't remember going anywhere else for any. No doctor was attending father then. He was working at the time bagging ore at Rickman's crusher. At the close of the last witness's evidence, Mrs. Woolcock, having requested liberty to speak, strongly condemned the boy being called as a witness. He did not, she said, understand the nature of an oath and was telling lies. She was informed, however, that this matter was one for the coroner and the jury to decide. The room was then cleared, and after a brief consultation, the jury decided that a post-mortem examination was necessary and the inquest adjourned. The adjourned inquest was held on the Friday at the courthouse at Moonta. Again, a doctor was brought up. He mentioned, I think from the symptoms that the deceased must have had a large quantity of mercury during his illness. There was a possibility of it arising from disease. If in small doses, the deceased must have been very susceptible. Either of the precipitates would occasion the symptoms seen. I've not prescribed mercury for the deceased at any time. I have not examined the other doctor's medicine. The deceased told me the medicine he had been taking had always made him sick and his teeth sore. I asked to see the medicine and was told that Dr. Bell had taken it away again. I was much surprised at this, as it was most unusual to take away medicines. I asked Mrs. Woolcock if she had tasted the medicine. She said she had put it to her lips at a time or two and it made her teeth sore. No other poisons would cause the symptoms. Salivation was the only specific symptom of poisoning. A bottle labelled chloride of zinc was handed in and examined, and this bottle had been found in the house. The contents are very poisonous and would produce several of the symptoms, such as irritation of the throat and stomach. It is one of the most irritant poisons we have. Another doctor stated that some substances produce these symptoms. The condition of the body might have arisen from natural disease causes, but I considered some of the symptoms to be associated with mercurial poisoning. I consider that the deceased had an overdose of mercury. I have not administered mercury in any shape, as the deceased was evidently then under the influence of mercury. I have no reason medically to believe that he had been improperly treated. There was no appearance of poison having been administered except mercury. Precipitate powder is a form of mercury. Charles Rook, chemist and manager at Moonta for Burke's. I have seen the lad Woolcock before in the shop buying things. I have sold him white precipitate powder. To the best of my knowledge, it was 3 weeks ago, and as so far as I can recollect, it is the only time I sold it to him. It was duly labelled poison. It was in the usual quantity sold. I remember Sergeant Bentley calling in July last to see if anybody had bought any strychnine. I asked if a person named Pascoe or something like that had bought the strychnine. A note was brought to me by the boy, but I did not preserve it. The contents of the note stated that the article wanted was to be used for oil. It bore a signature, Mary Edwards. It was written in pencil, evidently by an indifferent writer. 6pence worth of white precipitate would, in my estimation, be sufficient to produce severe salivation and death. Thomas John Woolcock was recalled and deposed. I remember going to Burke's chemist about 3 weeks or a month ago. I remember seeing Mr. Rook at the door. I got something in a bottle or else some precipitate powders. I'm not sure which. I got some morphine once. It was given to me by Mr. Rook. I took a note for it. My mother wrote the note. I took no note for the precipitate powders. I went once or twice for precipitate powders. The first time was a month or so ago. I went to Opie's twice for precipitate powder and then to Bathine's 2 or 3 times. I gave all the powders to Mother. She never gave me a note to get precipitate powders. I went to one chemist after another. I know no person named Mary Edwards. I am sure I took no note for precipitate powders. My mother, I think, gave the medicine to my father. I was not in the room. I always gave the medicine, the precipitate powders and the morphine to my mother. Father and Mother were kind to me. Mother took me in to see Father when he was sick. I went in to see him once or twice. Mother was there at the time. Pascoe came sometimes when Father was bad to see how he was. Pascoe used at one time to board with us. By boarding, I mean he used to live and sleep at our house until he got a house of his own. I don't think he stopped up with my father. He used to go in and see him sometimes. Pascoe was sometimes there after I went to bed. William Hartley deposed, I think I can remember the boy Woolcock coming to Mr. Bathine's shop. Mr. Bathine served him 1 shilling's worth of white precipitate powder, about half an ounce. This was about 3 weeks ago. The boy simply asked for it. I remember the boy coming into the shop before, but only remember him being served with white precipitate on one occasion. I received a letter posted to Cadena for me, returned to Moonta, my present address. I should say it was 6 or 7 weeks ago. It bore the signature Elizabeth Woolcock and enclosed 7 2-pence stamps for 20 grains of morphia to be sent to Mrs. Woolcock in the care of Pascoe. I have seen Mrs. Woolcock in the shop. I should say it was a month ago. She asked me for prussic acid. I explained that it was a deadly poison and that it was not to be sold or to be used by any person not accustomed to use it. I asked her what it was for, and she said, I believe it is for cleaning purposes. I did not supply morphia previously referred to. I sold her an ounce of oxalic acid instead. I told her it would answer the same purpose. Oxalic acid is an irritant poison. I had no reason to doubt she was telling the truth. I am quite positive the letter referred to was signed Elizabeth Woolcock. I cannot produce the letter because I have burnt it. I showed the letter to Mr. Beethan, who read it, and he said it was a strange thing to send to Cadena for morphia and advised me to take no notice of it, so I burnt the letter. John Opie was recalled, and he said he recollected a fortnight before, on the 25th of June, a little boy coming and asking for 3 penny worth of laudanum. I sent it by him and at the same time gave a memo containing the usual caution and told him to tell his mother if she wanted to have such a thing to send a note, as I did not care to let him have it on his word only. On July the 9th, I received a note written on a scrap of paper in red ink, signed Mary Edwards, requesting me to send the laudanum. I thought that there was a great resemblance to the writing in the letter I had received, signed Elizabeth Woolcock. I said to the boy who brought the note, "Whose little boy are you? Are you not Mrs. Woolcock's boy?" He said, "My mother is called Edwards and she lives at Crossroads." At the time he came, I could have sworn he was Mrs. Woolcock's boy, but by his stating his mother's name as Edwards, I supposed I was mistaken. But now I look at him and I believe the boy Woolcock is the same boy. John Nicholas deposed, "I reside between Yelta and East Moonta. I knew the deceased well, having been a near neighbour. I remember Pascoe living with him. That was before he was taken bad. Pascoe left him and went to Batch. I said to the deceased a good bit before he was taken to bed, about 2 months, 'Your lodger has left you,' and he replied, 'Yes, I don't want any lodger. I shan't keep any lodgers after this.' After Pascoe left, Woolcock and his wife had a growl now and then. I heard Mrs. Woolcock say so when she came to my place. I have seen Pascoe several times at Woolcock's place, both before and since he was taken bad. Pascoe, I think, was at Woolcock's yesterday afternoon or Thursday. I saw him there on one of the 2 days. I suppose he came there to see how the deceased was. Woolcock spoke to me about his dog being poisoned. He said he should like to find out who poisoned it. Pascoe was batching at the time. Elizabeth Snell was recalled. I was talking with Mrs. Woolcock on Tuesday evening last. We were conversing together about what she should do in the event of her husband dying. She said that she thought she could do better in Melbourne than she could here. She could earn 10 shillings a week and put the boy in boarding school. Nothing else transpired. I told the deceased before he died that the boy should not want for a crust while I had one. He did not say anything about his preferring me to keep the boy. Thomas John Woolcock was recalled by the foreman. I do not remember going to Mr. Opie's and getting laudanum. I remember going once with a scrap of paper written on it with red ink. I remember telling Mr. Opie that mother's name was Edwards and that she lived at Crossroads. My mother told me to say so. Mother gave me a scrap of paper. We had red ink in the house at that time. Mother can write. She did not write it in my presence. She gave it to me in the kitchen. She also told me to say at Burke's once her name was Edwards. She said Mary Edwards. I was getting the medicine in bottles. I always gave the bottles to Mother. I never saw what she did with them. She gave me the bottles to take. I think they had labels on them. Edward E. Bentley, the sergeant at police at Moonta, recalled. After the room was cleared for the deliberation of the jury at the inquest at Yelta yesterday, I took Mrs. Woolcock into a room by herself. I thought it best, after the evidence I had heard, to give her the usual caution that anything from that time that she might say might be used as evidence against her. After that, she told me she was with her husband when he came to me and complained of his dog being poisoned. She asked me, did I remember seeing her with him? I now recollect the deceased saying to me, "Do you see that woman? She's my wife. Don't take any notice of her." On walking up Ellen Street towards the corner with him, asked him, had he any suspicion of anyone poisoning his dog? He said no, he'd no suspicion but wished to know. Had anyone named Pascoe brought strychnine? I went down last night to attend the doctors at the postmortem examination. Mrs. Woolcock was in the kitchen. While there, she seemed faint and rose to go out. I followed her out and she complained of feeling very faint from want of sleep and something to eat. I advised her to drink a little brandy or wine, something of a stimulating nature, and she said she did not care about going for it. She also said if I touch anything it seems to taste and smell of the body. She had no appetite. From what I have ascertained, she hasn't eaten anything since. She came to me the second time and said, "Mr. Bentley, there is something I forgot to tell you. About a day or 2 ago, while my husband was ill, I said, if you should die, I've no doubt people will talk a great deal about me. And he said, never mind what they say. I then searched the shelves and cupboards and found the bottles of poison, chloride of zinc, produced on the mantelpiece in the front room behind a vase. Also 2 bottles of laudanum, labelled poison. I did not bring them, supposing them to have been supplied by the doctors. The jar and its contents I received from Dr. Dickey. The deceased said it was someone who knew the place as well as I do who poisoned the dog. He mentioned no names. This closed the evidence. The jury retired, and after half an hour they returned with the following verdict: that the deceased Thomas Woolcock came to his death through the effects of slow irritative poisoning, and that we are of the opinion the poison was given to him by his wife, Elizabeth Woolcock. On Mrs. Woolcock being asked by the coroner whether she had any statement to make, she said, "I did not do it. It would not be any benefit for me to do so. That is all I have to say." The coroner then said, "Elizabeth Woolcock, you stand committed to take your trial for willful murder of your husband and the next criminal sittings of the Supreme Court." Intense excitement has been caused by the affair throughout the district. She was sent to stand trial at the Supreme Court in Adelaide. A jury took less than half an hour to find her guilty. Despite their recommendations for mercy, given in the conflicting medical evidence and the lifelong abuse she had suffered, the judge, Mr. Justice Wearing, sentenced her to death. 2 weeks before her execution, Elizabeth wrote a confession and handed it to the Reverend James Bickford, who had been visiting her in the jail, with the instruction that it be read after her death. The confession was published in the South Australian Register on the 2nd of January 1874, and it's titled Confession of Elizabeth Woolcock. The following document has been handed to us for publication. It was enclosed in an envelope addressed to Reverend Mr. Bickford of Adelaide. Adelaide Jail, December 16th, 1873. The last statement and confession of Elizabeth Woolcock to Mr. Bickford. Sir, I was born in the Burra Mine in the province of South Australia in 1847. My parents' names were John and Elizabeth Oliver. They were Cornish and came to the colony in 1842, but they went to Victoria in 1851. I was left without the care of a mother at the age of 4 years, and I never saw her again until I was 18. My father died when I was 9 years old, and I had to get my living until I was 18, and then I heard that my mother was alive and residing at Moonta Mine. She wrote me a letter asking me to come to her, as she had been very unhappy about me, and she was very sorry for what she had done. I thought I should like to see my mother and have a home like other young girls, so I gave up my situation and came to Adelaide. My mother and stepfather received me very kindly, and I had a good home for 2 years. My mother and stepfather were members of the Wesleyan Church, and I became a teacher in the Sunday school for 2 years. At the end of that time, I first saw my late husband, Thomas Woolcock. My late husband was a widower with 2 children. His wife had been dead about 8 months when I went to keep house for him against my stepfather's wishes. I kept house for him for 6 weeks when someone told my stepfather I was keeping company with Thomas Woolcock. He asked me if it was true, and I told him it was not. But he would not believe me, but called me a liar and told me he would cripple me if I went with him any more. And I, being very self-willed, told him that I had not been with the man, but I would go with him now, if he asked me. I saw my husband in the evening, and he asked me what was the matter, and I told him what had taken place on the Sunday, and he asked me to go with him for a walk instead of going to the chapel. I went. My stepfather missed me from the chapel and came to look for me. He met us both together, so I was afraid to go home, for as he had said he would break both my legs, I was afraid that he would keep his word. So I went to a cousin's of my husband's and stopped, and my husband asked me if I would marry him, and for my word's sake, I did. We were married the next Sunday morning by licence, after the acquaintance of 7 weeks. I was not married long before I found out what sort of man I had got, and that my poor stepfather had advised me for my good. It was too late then, so I had to make the best of it. I tried to do my duty to him and the children, but the more I tried, the worse he was fond of drink, and he did not like to part with his money for anything else, and God only knows how he ill-treated me. I put up with it for 3 years. During that time, my parents went to Melbourne, and then he was worse than ever. I thought I would rather die than live, so I tried to put an end to myself in several different ways. I thought I would leave him and get my own life, so I left him, but he would not leave me alone. He came and fetched me home, and then I stopped with him for 12 months. I left him again with the intention of going to my mother. I took £6 with me, and I came down to Adelaide and stopped with my sister for 6 weeks. He then came and fetched me back again. But he did not behave no better to me. I tried my best to please him, but I could not. There is no foundation at all for the story about the young man called Pascoe. He was nothing to me, nor did I give the poor dog any poison, for I knew what power that poison had, as I took it myself for some months when I was so ill-treated that I was quite out of my mind. My husband was taken ill at the mine and came home and quarrelled with me, and Satan tempted me, and I gave him what I ought not. But I thought at the time, if I gave him time to prepare to meet his God, I should not do any great crime to send him out of the world. But I see my mistake. Now thank God he had time to make his peace with his Maker, and I hope shall meet him in heaven, for I feel that God has pardoned all of my sins. He has forgiven me and washed me white in the precious blood of Jesus. I feel this evening that I can rejoice in the love of the Saviour. I feel his presence here tonight. He sustains me and gives me comfort under this heavy trial, such as the world can never give. Dear friend, if I may call you, so I am much obliged to you for your kindness to a poor guilty sinner. But great will be the reward in heaven, and I hope I shall meet you there. I hope that God will keep me faithful to the end. Yours truly, a sinner saved by grace. Elizabeth Lillian Woolcock. On the 30th of December 1873, Elizabeth was hanged in the yard at Adelaide Jail. She was only 26 years old. And an article that outlines this in detail was on the 3rd of January 1874 in the Wallaroo Mining Journal at Port Wallaroo, South Australia. Execution of Elizabeth Woolcock. Respecting the execution of Elizabeth Woolcock, the extreme penalty of the law was carried out at the Adelaide Jail on Tuesday morning, the 30th of December, in the case of Elizabeth Woolcock, found guilty at the last criminal sessions of the murder of her husband, Thomas Woolcock, by poisoning. The convict has been attended since her conviction by the Reverend J. Bickford, and after his first visit manifested great penitence and seemed to be perfectly resigned to the fate which she knew awaited her. The hour fixed for the execution was 8 o'clock, and at that time she was taken from the condemned cell, accompanied by the Reverend J. Bickford and the governor of the jail. She walked to the place of execution and ascended the scaffold without saying anything. The Reverend J. Bickford having offered prayer, the rope was adjusted, and after the usual formalities, the bolt was drawn. Death did not immediately ensue. Fully 5 minutes elapsed before the convulsion of the body ceased, but it was afterwards ascertained that dislocation was produced when the drop fell. South Australia had been fortunately free for a long time from cases in which the penalty of death has had to be inflicted. 11 years elapsed between the execution of Malachi Martin for the murder of Jane McMenison in 1862 and that of Mrs. Woolcock. In the years since her death, questions have been raised over whether she did indeed commit this crime, whether the confession was written entirely by someone else, and how much of this story was the result of mental instability created by her tragic life. And just some information on her step-siblings. William Grenfell Williams was born on the 26th of January 1841 in Cornwall. William married Eliza Rowe Davey on the 16th of July 1864 at Ballarat. He was a miner, and William died at Long Gully, Victoria, on the 28th of May 1904, aged 63. Mary Martha Williams was born on the 2nd of October 1842 in Cornwall. Mary married Robert Ralph Slape on Christmas Day 1862 at St John's, Adelaide. They had 12 children, and they lived at Second Creek and Burnside, South Australia, where Robert worked as a gardener. Slape Gully is named after Robert, and this is the sister that she's referring to in her confession, and also this is the daughter that's referred to in Elizabeth Senior's death, where she said that she died at her son-in-law's residence. So Mary Slape died on the 10th of August 1913 at Marrittville, South Australia, aged 70. Caroline Johns was born on the 14th of November 1855 in White Hills, South Australia. And Elizabeth Jr. would have been 7 years old at the time of her stepsister's birth. Caroline's wedding certificate gives her parents as John Johns and Elizabeth Tresize. John Bolitho Johns Jr. was born at Second Creek, South Australia on the 22nd of July 1856. He married Maria Louisa Halls in Victoria in 1881 when he was 25 and Maria 20, and John died at Albert Park, Victoria in November 1912, aged 56. and there's a small article outlining his death. The remains of Mr. John Bolitho Johns of Albert Park, Melbourne, formerly of Ballarat, were interred in the Ballarat Old Cemetery on Saturday. The deceased was a very prominent member of the Ballarat Fire Brigade and held office of secretary for a number of years. Members of the Ballarat City and Buninyong brigades were well represented. And the other step-sibling, Thomas Johns, was born at Second Creek, South Australia on the 26th of July, 1858, but he died at 8 months old on the 16th of March, 1859, at Second Creek. And Elizabeth's stepson, Thomas Woolcock's son. Thomas John Woolcock was only 10 when his father died and when his stepmother was hung in 1873. He married Annie Christina Hanson in Queensland on the 8th of December 1890 when he was 27. They had 6 children and they lived at Welcome Flat near Townsville in 1903, and Thomas was a minor. It seems that there were some issues with their marriage, as on the 22nd of October 1903 at Charters Towers there was an article mentioning Thomas and Christina. The only case before the court this morning was one showing the hapless fate of a man married to a confirmed female dipsomaniac, in other words, an alcoholic. Christina Woolcock proceeded against her husband, Thomas Woolcock, for using threatening language towards her with "I'll shoot you." The threat may be alarming, and the woman, knowing the extreme provocation she had given, may have felt that the words had a significance. The defendant pleaded guilty and when asked if he had anything to say, said she had left home on Thursday and returned home on Saturday drunk. This was the woman who conveyed the drink to the unfortunate woman who was found suffocated with her head buried in her pillow at the Grand Secret some time ago. The defendant was bound over his own recognizance of £20 and a surety of £10 to keep the peace for 6 months. In bitterness of soul, no doubt the unfortunate man used the threat, but his appearance was rather that of a long-suffering martyr than an aggressor. Such is life. Is marriage a failure? Perhaps, perhaps not. Thomas died on the 5th of October 1909 at Charters Towers, Queensland, aged only 46.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.